TV party tonight. Alright! We're gonna have a TV party, alright! Tonight! We've got nothing better to do than watch TV and have a couple of brews. Everybody's gonna hang out here tonight! Alright! We'll pass out on the couch. Alright! Tonight! We got nothing better to do than watch TV and have a couple of brews. Don't talk about anything else. We don't want to know. We're dedicated to our favorite show.
And tonight, our favorite show is Our World War, brought to you by the good people at BBC Three and Netflix. And we're wishing you a belated Happy Veterans Day. Of course, I'm your host of this here TV party, Mr. Mark Radulich. And joining me tonight from our Canadian office is the one and only Professor Andrew Graham. How do you do, sir?
I'm doing good, Mark. How do you do?
I do quite well, thank you very much. Now, we've been planning this since last year, as a matter of fact, if I remember correctly. We did Five Came Home. Was that the name of it? Five Came Home? Yes. We did Five Came
Back.
Five Came Back. And Andrew said offline, he said, hey, there's this other series on Netflix that I think you would really enjoy. And why don't we kind of do it around Veterans Day? And I said, all right. And that was Our World War. So I'm going to pitch it over to you, Mr. Graham. Why don't you tell us a little bit about this show and what tickled your fancy about it and why you wanted to do it?
Well, I think the main reason that I want to bring this one up is that you call it Veterans Day, but we call it Remembrance Day here in Canada. In the UK, they call it Armistice Day. This one and those days kind of all line up with the end of the First World War, which was November 11th, 1918. It being 2018, this is actually the centenary of that war ending. So I'd come across this one a couple years ago on Netflix, had enjoyed it a fair amount, and thought it'd be kind of a fun one to talk about relative to Remembrance Day just passing by.
So now I don't watch a lot of like History Channel and stuff like that, so I was really taken aback by the style in which the series was crafted. What we have here is a dramatization of historical events based on first-person accounts. But they also use, and I want to get your opinion on this, because I'll tell you, I read some of the reviews, and to say it was mixed would be an understatement. So it's historical accounts, first-person accounts, mixed with some varied and interesting use of camera, helmet cams, barrel cams, that sort of thing, drones for overhead shots. They mix that in with infrared, some mapping technology so that you can kind of see what's going on in these battles, and then modern music. Like PJ Harvey, and this is 2014 we're talking about here. I right out of the gate, I was reading a bunch of reviews on this, and those that did not like it cited the introduction of modern music as trivializing these events. When you were watching this, what was some of your thoughts?
I definitely caught me the first time through as well. And I mean, I haven't read much of the background on the series, but if I had to take a guess on why they did a lot of that stuff, I think they definitely did some of that to try and attract Generation Call of Duty. Like, I mean, even specifically in the first episode, you mentioned they use a lot of that overhead infrared camera, and that is literally something out of a Call of Duty game. And I think what they were trying to do with using some of those techniques was kind of not so much trivialize it, but take away some of the, for lack of a better word, the historical import, and try and make it relatable to people who might not watch a lot of history, or who might have gone through history or social studies class with one eye open, and just have a hard time relating to what that period was 100 years ago.
Yeah, one of the things about this, I mean, granted it's on Netflix, so you don't have the surfing through channels kind of a thing happening here. With Netflix, it's sort of a dedicated choice. You might be flipping through still shots of what's on there, but you're not actually seeing the action while you're doing it like you would with traditional television. But I'll tell you, if you were, you could almost be convinced that this is saving without just a few seconds of any one shot, that this is Hamburger Hill or Saving Private Ryan, yeah, that sort of thing. And I don't mean this specifically the war. I mean this looks and it's shot like any number of war pictures. And I definitely. Go ahead.
I was about to say, and I think that's part of it. And I mean, I think part of the challenge around this, and part of the intention behind why they did that, is, I think the overall, I guess the kind of the general perception and thoughts around World War I, both, I guess, basically across the world, because I think, on some level, World War II is very easy to talk about in a lot of ways, because for one thing, the conflict is morally very black and white. It's a very, for lack of a better word, and not to trivialize it, but it's a very filmable war. You had fast planes, you had fast tanks, you had lots of movement, and I mean, World War I is very much always thought of as only ever being in the trenches. Gas, it's thought of as a very pointless war, and I mean, they don't get into this in this series, but talking about it on a larger scale, I actually think World War I I've studied more about it. I didn't focus on that in university, but read a lot about it afterwards. And the more you read about it, the more you start to realize that World War I and its aftermath was really what shaped the 20th century.
Oh, absolutely. The world doesn't punish Germany the way that it does. There might not even have been a World War II. And
I mean, there's definite arguments about that, but I mean, even going beyond that, there's a fantastic book by a historian named Margaret Macmillan called Paris 1919.
I've read it.
Talks about Oh, you've read it? Okay, yes. So you know that this then goes basically Syria, Israel, parts of Africa, parts of the Middle East. A lot of those conflicts can get traced back to the Versailles Conference.
Yep. Yeah, the handling of the fallout of World War I by Britain is probably one of the greatest travesties of the 21st century. It's handled in retrospect. I mean, and how would they have known this at the time? But it's handled in retrospect so poorly.
Oh yeah, and I mean it goes beyond Britain too. France had a lot to say at the table. The Americans, well, you could argue that by way of absence, there was a lot of impact there. I mean,
yeah, we kind of packed our bags and said, "Look, you guys figure this out. Lots of luck. We're going to go home and play Call of Duty."
Something like that, yeah.
I hate to use the word trivialize. I hate to trivialize this, but and I'm bringing this up because one of the reviews I read on this was they're seeking to make something that is inherently boring, action-filled and dramatic, and something that really will hold on to an audience. But the cold hard fact of the matter is the war is boring. It reminded me of the best scene in the entire movie, Wonder Woman. Have you seen it?
Oh yes, I know what you're talking about. It's the No Man's Land scene,
right? And they say right there, there's look, we've been at this stalemate for months. And granted, in real life, we don't have an invincible Amazon to go running into the bullets for us, but it spoke to one of the issues of World War I, which is, dug-in, trenched warfare, not going anywhere for months at a time. And, if you as a producer, you as a director, how do you capture that and then make it palatable for an audience that is, not going to sit that has so many choices to watch things. How are you going to make this stand out above the rest and get their interest? So they definitely had a time on their hands. So I give them a lot of credit for using the interesting camera techniques, that they did and the music and everything else to really make this an engaging experience. I mean, I'm not one that chases after this stuff, but, you know, when told, hey, why don't you watch this, I thought, you know what? This could have been a lot worse. This could have been a lot less enjoyable.
And I mean, history was what I studied in university, and you know, I like good history. I like good historical film. I'm also willing to say, okay, at some point there's a good solid line between, you know, being somewhat authentic and going out there with good intentions to educate people, and then also, you know, when you're getting into your strictly like correct historical stuff too. And I think this actually strikes a pretty nice balance.
It does. Let's get into the nitty-gritty here. This is 3 episodes. The first episode is entitled The First Day, and the summary goes like this. 2 weeks after war is declared, the 4th Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers set up defenses around the Belgian town of Mons. They expect to march beyond the town's bridges the next morning. Little do they know, however, the German army has already reached the other side of the canal. Wow, so I know nothing about this. I had no knowledge of this battle going in. World War I, not a subject I'm tremendously steeped in. So I really came at this, you know, as a virgin. And this was a tragic battle if you're rooting for the English.
Oh yeah, and well, this was a tragic battle in general. So. Do you want to just give the Coles Notes version of how World War I started, and then I'll take it from there?
Yeah, go ahead.
So basically, early in the 20th century, all the great powers had more or less formed two main alliances: the Triple Entente, which was Russia, England, and the British Empire, and then on the other side was a Triple Alliance, which was Austria-Hungary. Now I'm having a moment. Germany, and then I believe it was the Ottoman Empire.
Yes, you are correct. And I only know that because I can hear Eddie Izzard in the back of my mind going, the Austria-Hungary Empire just deflated like a flan in a cupboard.
Yeah, exactly. The Ottoman Empire had basically been in decline for the last century, mainly because of the acts of the other European powers, and they were falling apart economically, militarily, everything like that. Anyway, so July 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary is assassinated in Sarajevo by a Serbian separatist group called the Black Hand. This, of course, makes both the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans very, very angry, so they want to go punish Serbia. But Serbia is not necessarily in a formal, but a nationalistic alliance with Russia because they're all of Slavic descent. So basically Russia basically said, these Slavic people here, we're not going to let you fight them, to which the Germans said, okay, great, we'll fight you too. Everyone started their mobilization process. France then, of course, was also brought into this. And then we get this really interesting thing called the Schlieffen Plan, which was one of the German generals. And basically, the thing was, Germany knew that they could not fight both France and Russia at the same time. So what they had to do was go in there, knock France out in the first round, then basically fight a holding action against Russia. Then once France was defeated, turn around, go fight the Russians and beat them. So what ended up happening was that they came up with this mobilization plan. And a quick aside, there's a very good series of podcasts by Dan Carlin from Hardcore History called Countdown to Armageddon. And one of his larger theories on the whole thing is that World War I is actually a show of how we got this whole culture of basically you start the ticking clock, it can't stop, and then war begins. Kind of an analogy to nuclear war and countdowns and stuff like that. Anyway, they all know they have to do this with a certain amount of time or else the other guys will mobilize first, your plans will be found out, anything like that. So basically the Schlieffen Plan boils down to the Germans were going to attack against the main French-German border, go through there, but they were also going to put in what was called the right hook, going out, kind of a wide right hook, going through Belgium, which was neutral at the time. and basically outflank the French, take Paris, end the war that way. And for various reasons, they got found out that there had been a lot of trading back and forth on that plan, and the Belgians put up a really good resistance. They got slowed down. Britain wasn't originally in this war, but they said, we are guaranteeing Belgium's neutrality, so if you go into Belgium, then we're fighting too. Of course, Germans come into Belgium. The British send the expeditionary force, and then basically they get first stationed in Mons, and Mons is where they actually make first contact.
Okay. One of the major points of this episode is, and there's actually almost a demonstration of sorts, between the machine gun, the planted machine gun, and the rifles. And so there's a great little bit where... and I'm sure you'll tell me the character's name. Well, I shouldn't say character. You'll tell me the person's name. But there's... You've seen this a million times in other movies, by the way. You have the one guy going, we have the greatest weapon in the history of armaments. Our Death Star will bring, will bring down planets far and wide. And the other guy going, yes, but the Force is a thing. So now that I've compared World War I to Star Wars... you have the one guy going, here we have the machine guns, and these are the great things, and they will fire bullets at a rate of X, X per second, and we can wipe out waves of German soldiers, lickety-split. These are the most important things we've got here. And the other guy says, okay, but how about the aim? And so he throws a thing in the air, and of course they shoot it with the machine gun and miss it entirely. And then they do the same thing with the riflemen, and all the riflemen hit the fucking thing. It's great. Well, what we have here is some dug-in the Royal Fusiliers. What are Fusiliers exactly?
So Fusiliers, I actually had to look this up because you've heard the phrase a lot, Fusiliers. Do you know Sherlock?
The character, the detective,
the show with Martin Freeman and Benedict Cumberbatch.
I am aware that it exists.
Okay, well, I mean that's a common one because Watson was a Fusilier. Okay. So Fusilier is basically just they're a form of infantry. It's they just take their name from an old style of rifle. So. Or old style of musket, rather. So a lot of the British names and a lot of the unit regimental names all come from older versions of what the regiment was when it was formed in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. So, for example, Fusiliers, they used a fusil. Grenadiers carried grenades. You still have dragoons, which were technically a mounted infantry, but now they're just armored regiments and so on and so forth. And you have cavalry regiments, which, of course, are now just armor.
So, let's talk about this episode here. What we have is, what we're going to see is waves of German conscripts. They make a point of saying that, and I think it's something to talk about here.
Yep.
Because years from when this takes place, Donald Rumsfeld will try to calm people's nerves by saying, we will not be using a draft army. A draft army stinks, in so few words. They'll never be as good as an enlisted army, for any number of reasons. So don't worry about the Iraq War. We're not going to start drafting people. And despite him saying this, I can't tell you how many people said, oh my God, we're going to war in Iraq, we're going to get drafted. So I bring that up because, again, you have a conversation taking place in this episode of the enlisted army versus conscripts. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, and this will also feed into the second episode quite a bit as well when we talk about the PALS regiments and the PALS battalions. So basically, by necessity of having a very large empire, the British actually maintained a small but very good professional army, where basically that was their profession. They went out, they drilled every day, they shot every day, everything like that. But like I said, the one thing they had against it was that it was very small. I think one of the German officials was once asked in the run-up to the war, what would happen if the British Expeditionary Force shows up? And he said, I shall have them arrested. because he thought they were that small. Meanwhile, on the continent, a lot of what, and a lot of a contributing factor to this war was the state of militarism, which is basically just very military geared societies. So kids did drill in school, they did rifle work in school. Everyone wasn't necessarily conscript, but a lot of them were reservists. So, I mean, maybe you had a fairly small core of professionals, and then around that you had your reservists who went out, trained a couple of times a month, a couple of weeks a year, and that formed the larger one. And then once you had a war start, and then this is where that ticking clock thing I mentioned came up earlier, is that basically they have a mobilization timeline to say, okay, we're going to war, get your regiments and your battalions to start mobilizing, and then all of those, they'll grow to what they call their war strength, and then they'll move them to where they need to fight. So basically it's full-time professionals versus trained but non-professional reservists and conscripts in some cases.
So one of the things that really rang out to me was, so they opened fire with the machine guns, and they're taking down one soldier after another, and one of the British guys actually remarks that, like they're just walking into it, and he's like, well, there's the difference. And I'm actually reminded of what folks used to say about a possible land war between the United States and China. We may have the best trained military on the planet, but it's hard to fight a war when you're fighting at like a 100-to-1 ratio. At some point, you're just going to get overwhelmed, no matter how many of these guys you take out. And that's kind of what ends up happening here, is that they take out a large swath of the army, but they just keep coming. There's just too many bodies, and eventually that group gets overwhelmed.
Yeah, definitely, and that goes to the phrase. Sorry, I'm trying to look up who actually quoted this one. I think it actually might have been Stalin, but what is it? Quantity has a quality all of its own.
Yeah.
Where basically you eventually pile on. I mean, as you saw, as the battle went on, it was just weight of numbers, and then also, you started to see them start to bring in some artillery pieces, zero in some artillery on the British as well. And I mean, things like the machine gun and the gas mask are kind of a lot of the things that are very much associated with World War I. But by far the deadliest thing in that war was artillery.
Sure.
There were I'll tell you some numbers about the Somme when we talk about episode 2, but you'll kind of get a good idea on where that is. But yeah, I mean, it's basically holding the line against the wave. And I mean, this was one machine gun, with everyone trying to go over a bridge, which is a fairly small geographical area, and then a bunch of guys with rifles. As the war went on, and once the trenches got established, what they started to do was actually set up the machine guns. And actually, they show this pretty well in Wonder Woman, is that you get what are called fields of interlocking fire. So basically, all the machine guns have a way that can traverse, and all the machine guns are set up in a way where if one machine gun's being attacked, it has its fire, and then other machine guns can also fire in its arc as well. And you've got 2 or 3 machine guns firing on a target now.
Let's flip the script a little bit. What did you think of the individual actors' performances? And there was a comment made in one of the reviews that I read that they, try as they might, some of these guys didn't even get the accents right, which you'd only know if you're actually from England. But, being a Yankee over here, I'm like, it sounds fine to me. I had no idea that was a thing until someone pointed it out, and I think it was a Guardian review. But, you could have fooled me. I'm watching these performances, and, and the actors and their makeup and everything, and, I feel like it took you there. Granted, I have no frame of reference, but to me, it felt like they put on an honest to good, stellar performance here. Everyone. I don't at any time feel like I'm watching a production. This feels like they really just, went back in time and just dropped a camera into what was happening there. What did you think of the dramatization and the performances?
I thought for the most part it was pretty good. I found a lot of the actors very engaging. I thought I mean, you can quibble the authenticity of the dialogue and stuff like that, but no, I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I mean, I think they effectively got across what they were trying to get across at any point. Episode 1, I personally kind of loved the Scottish sapper who was the corporal there, who was trying to blow up the bridge. I thought he had that really fine line of kind of black humor and efficiency that I found quite amusing.
You think you think someday some screenwriter has the? Do you think this thing could live on as a feature film? This battle, or is anything that's said was said? Anything that needs to be said was said in this episode.
Well, I mean, this was a very the thing about all three of these episodes. These are very small engagements as part of a very much larger war. So this entire the Battle of Mons was part of the larger Battle of the Frontiers, which was basically all this crossing of borders. It ended with the Battle of the Marne in basically November, December of that year. And I haven't been able to nail down an exact number, but once you put all these together, you had something on the order of 500,000 fatalities during this time.
Oof.
So this is an absolutely epic scale of epic, Armageddon level of death going on here, and something that totally blew everyone's mind. Then basically once that battle, the Battle of the Frontiers, fizzled out and the Battle of the Marne ended, that's basically where we get into stalemate.
Anything about the first day that I haven't covered here that you feel obliged to talk about?
No, I think it covered everything off fairly well. I mean, I think it got kind of the broad strokes of the history of what happened, and I mean, and some of the things that you come across are certainly incredible. But I mean, like I said, these are things that have happened. The first time I think I heard about this particular incident was actually in another documentary called War and Civilization from about 10 years ago. That was really good, but I think this one was good. On some level, it's probably one of my favorites because I think it also communicates some of the more subtle oddities of the start of the First World War. Like, you noticed almost nobody had helmets.
Yeah.
So everyone, to that point, they hadn't thought they needed helmets. And I mean, really, the helmets that they came in with later weren't so much against rifle bullets or anything like that. They were more against artillery shells coming over the top.
Right. Let's move on
to...
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say the other interesting thing that you might have thought was kind of weird, but the two lieutenants that were involved, you might have noticed they didn't have anything more than pistols.
Right.
And there was a very strong cultural thing at this point. Like, war was very, going to the whole militarism idea, war was very much thought of as kind of a sporting endeavor still. I mean, you started to see some levels of industrialization, but it was still kind of a very sporting thing. So there was even a perception, and even some British officers didn't even carry a pistol, and they just brought a cane or something like that because they thought they were going to be out there just directing the men into battle, and they wouldn't have to do anything themselves. And this wasn't anything too wild either. I mean, to put things in perspective, the British at least were going to war in khakis. They were kind of ahead when it came to concealment. The French were going out in blue shirts and red pants. And there's even, like, some of the Germans were going out, they were what we called cuirassiers, because they were literally wearing breastplates. And, like, shiny breastplates.
Right. I have to do this. This is just, it's my thing, but I'm reminded of a Bill Cosby bit where he was like, what if every war started off with a coin toss, like in a football game? And he does different examples, and one of them is, okay, let's go to the Revolutionary War. And it's like, okay, settlers, you win the toss. What do you call? Like, all right, the settlers say that they're going to wear any clothes they want and hide in the trees and the bushes, and the British have to wear bright red coats and march in a line.
Oh, exactly. And I mean, that was still very much the way of war. And I mean, I think we're kind of segueing into part two, and we'll kind of talk about that in a minute.
Yeah, no, I want to get right. Let's get right into it. So, pals are.
Yep.
This is the second episode, and the synopsis goes like this: a group of office workers from Levenshulme, Manchester, join a local PALS battalion, the 18th Battalion Manchester Regiment. They soon find themselves facing the Germans at the Somme. Months later, Paddy Kennedy pleads with the battalion chaplain to let him off the firing squad duty that will see him killing one of his friends he made on his journey. Not gonna lie, I got through about half of this, and I nodded off or whatever, and I never was able to get back to the part where he's in the firing squad. So let's just cut right to the chase here. Explain how we got there.
Okay, so I mean, this one there's a couple of different things at play. Maybe first I'll talk about what the PALs are. So right after everything went to stalemate, the British very simply figured out, along with everybody else, that this is going to turn into a war of attrition. We're not going to be in mobile warfare, so basically it's going to be us outlasting the other guys. So one of the things that they came up with, and the Lord Kitchener, who was the Secretary of State for War, if I believe at that time that's basically like the equivalent of what you call a defense secretary, he came up with the idea of a PALS battalion, where basically you start guaranteeing people who enlist the ability to fight with a localized battalion who were all in, who knew each other, who were from the same city, same locality. And part of what that would do is that, one, that would inspire people to enlist, and two, that would give you, from the get-go, a very tight, a tight grouping, a tight esprit de corps.
A brotherhood.
A brotherhood, exactly. A lot of places to positively start out with. In Canada during the First World War, that system definitely came up where we kind of came up with a similar battalion system for very different reasons, involving a very oddball minister of militias, but I'm not getting into Sam Hughes right now. A lot of the battalions from Canada started to become very localized, and they started. And after the war, when those old battalions folded, they got folded into the history of our current infantry regiments. So, like in Calgary, it tends to be the 10th Battalion and the 50th Battalion were used a lot in the World War I, and then they are now in the histories of our local regiments, like the Calgary Highlanders and the King's Own Calgary Regiment.
Okay.
So that's part one.
Yes.
Sorry, I'll set up the Psalm, too, since that one gets a little wild. So the second part, that's kind of the PALS Battalion. The other part of this is the Battle of the Somme, which was an attempt in July of 1916 to basically try and do one of two things: break the war open, and then also really concentrate on a second front for the French, because the Germans had kind of drugged them into a little bit of a meat grinder, or a major meat grinder, in a place called Verdun, which was further on down the front, and they needed to basically try and take the heat off the French because it was literally breaking the French army. And the whole idea of the Somme was basically, we are going to shell the hell out of the German lines. I think the number I've heard is about 4 million shells, or what was the initial bombardment? They bombarded the German lines for about a week to a week and a half straight. A couple of million shells went over, with the assumption that that basically at that point the Germans would be dead, their trenches would be in ruins, there'd be no wire, and everyone could walk over, and that would be it. No plan survived first contact with the enemy, and no one told the Germans that, because basically none of those things worked. And literally people and you know what, maybe I'll stop there and we'll talk a little bit more about the episode and as far as you went.
Okay, so where I got to in this, I saw the whole enlistment, the guy reading the letter, them all lining up. Now this flashes back and forward. You have the one fella who is getting into it with the chaplain. I remember there's one exchange of dialogue with the chaplain. It's just like, yeah, you really don't want this to end with me kicking your ass and having to tell people that.
Oh yeah,
that's good stuff. But it definitely speaks to the idea of, I'm going to enlist in the army and I'm going to serve my country. And boy, sometimes the U.S. to do things that are distasteful. It's all for the greater good, but it's a it can be a harrowing experience. It's just not shooting the bad guys. And I think that's that's ultimately what this episode, from what I saw, was about. Was the idea of, I got into this with the best of intentions and got out of it having lost a part of my soul. This one particular character, Patty Kennedy. But that's me being overly poetic. Why don't you give me some specifics?
No, I think that's not. I wouldn't say that's inaccurate. And I mean, I think that's a really common thing, even in this, where my personal story, my great grandfather on my mom's side, he was from Kent, England. He emigrated over here and actually faked his age by 2 years so he could enlist, and he was basically in the Canadian Army for about 2 years, and was. They have all the war records now digitalized online, so I was able to look up a service record, and I think literally at the beginning of August 1918, before the final big offensive started, they found him out and shipped him home. So I mean, there was a lot of enthusiasm for people joining up, and I mean, it's something that seems unintuitive on a lot of ways, and I mean, you start getting into the conversation of why did this war persist. And I think on some level, and the chaplain kind of made the point, and whether or not you agree with it, it's one of the thoughts they had was, at some point, if we lose this war, we've lost a couple of 100,000 lives for nothing. Sure. If we don't win.
No, to me, it makes all the sense in the world. Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, the one thing about why people probably ask why didn't they end it sooner is because of the way things had folded up. Basically, most of Belgium and large parts of France were under German control. So if the Allies wanted to sue for peace, they were giving up a lot of territory to what was a fairly unpredictable government at that point. And they would have been in the position to dictate peace and extract reparations and make dictations to the other side that they would have found pretty distasteful.
Not for nothing, but if you're also the British, do you really want the Germans that close to you? Having taken that much land, you want to push them, as far back to their original boundaries, if not smaller than possible. I mean, I think about life after World War II and the Russians, and them creating the Soviet bloc because, after a while you just get tired of people rushing headlong into St. Petersburg.
Definitely. And I mean, that was kind of part of it was modern Germany is a relatively young country. If you really want to get technical, Canada's older than Germany by about 4 years. And when Germany unified and started to kind of assert its power, Britain was definitely one of their main rivals. I mean, one of the big things that, again, they talk about was the arms race that was going on, and that wasn't over land arms. That was over naval arms. Mm-hmm. So battleships and things like that were a huge thing. And then, of course, as we know, one of the big things that factored into both world wars were the use of the U-boat.
All right, so... So what happens in this episode? I need to kind of walk me through the plot of this thing.
So basically, I'm going to try and do it as chronologically as possible. So basically, the Manchester Regiment that Patty's a part of, they start out by going through some of the... Did you see the training part?
Yes.
Yes. So, I mean, there's a good one that I was kind of mentioning earlier with the Somme where literally the guys are being trained not to run in and bayonet guys, but to walk up and bayonet them because, again, there's this assumption that everything will be gone. And that is as out there as it seems, it is absolutely true. One of the stories of the Somme was at Beaumont-Hamel, where the Royal Newfoundland Regiment basically did that exact thing where they were walking across the battlefield. And the Germans made a point of saying it was a magnificent display of discipline and soldierliness on the field, but the Royal Newfoundlands took 90% casualties out of a population of about 200,000. It happened on July 1st, which is Canada Day, but it's also kind of a secondary remembrance day for the province of Newfoundland and Labrador as well.
That is a lot. That is a large portion of your generation just gone. One of the things I remember... Go ahead.
I was about to say, because I was looking into numbers and stuff like that to try and put things in perspective. So, Canadian bias, I'm going to use this one. So talking about the First World War, in Canada in the First World War, we started out with a population of about 8 million. We put about 650,000 into the field during that entire war. Current numbers are about 66,500 died. So if you were in the military, you had a 1 in 10 chance of dying. And here's the thing that a lot of people also don't realize about the First World War. Of those 66,000, 11,000 of them have no known grave.
Oof.
And that's, I mean, the British lost 800,000.
I'm assuming people just got shredded by artillery fire in most of those cases.
Basically, yeah. They're on, there's a, in the city of Ypres or Ypres, or there's a couple of different pronunciations, but in Belgium where a lot of the major battles took place, there's what's called the Menin Gate, and there it has the names of about 55,000 Commonwealth and British troops, and I believe also French troops, that don't have any known grave there. And every day they still go out and they do like a last post ceremony, basically.
There's a scene in this episode where we have sniper fire. The regiment is taking sniper fire, and you have the one battalion leader wanting to do X and realizing that this is going to get them all shot. Our lead here decides to take it upon himself to go against command and run across the field, taking fire so that the rest of the battalion, it looks like, can identify where the sniper is.
Yep.
I just thought that was an interesting scene. Problem is, I don't remember what happens after that.
So that happens there, and I think it's the Truno Wood, which I don't know too much about. The Somme was an enormous battle, went on for 6 months. And I do know from generalities, fighting in woods during the First World War was not a good idea, because generally if you were going in there, the Germans were very, and I mean, this is a weakness of the series, they didn't have a chance to really show what trench warfare was like and exactly when you were fighting an army who could be totally defensive, how well prepared they could be. So they would have machine guns set up, they'd have all their artillery pre-sighted, everything along that line. So basically, you go into one of these woods, and you could literally have Germans dropping in from anywhere or popping up from anywhere, and that's what made those sorts of battles very, very terrifying. So they went in there. I guess they don't show it, but later, I believe it was probably Paddy's platoon got cut off, so that means he lost contact with everybody else, and they're basically kind of in small groups wandering around, and that's where they run into. No, and I can't remember the name of the character who is executed later, but they run into him. He's basically just hiding and walking by everybody. They actually end up getting Paddy and a couple of, they separate, and that guy goes another way and gets picked up later. But him and a few of his friends actually get caught by the Germans. One of his friends gets killed. Then the Germans get caught in an ambush. They run away. And one of the important things about it is that he actually runs into another formation, a Scottish, actually specifically a Highlander formation, because they were actually wearing kilts. And during the course of that, something very important happens, which is Paddy reports to one of their officers, and he ends up being given a chit, and I don't know how much it's used in the U.S., but chit's a fairly common phrase in American or in British and Canadian military. For basically, it's a note saying, I'm an officer from this regiment, I've run into your soldier, here's what happened. And that becomes a big crux of the argument, where when Paddy eventually is able to find his way back to his unit, he reports to his CO and gives him his chit, and he's like, oh, great, welcome back. And one of the arguments made is that the guy who kind of was just hiding out in the woods and kind of ran into him and was basically hiding out, he had come back and he had never run into anybody. He didn't have anything, and basically he was accused of desertion before the enemy, which was during a time of war as a capital offense.
Hence the firing squad, I'm guessing.
Exactly.
Okay. So what we have here is a guy who is accused of desertion. I'm guessing he's going to be tried and executed via firing squad, and Paddy is going to be a part of this firing squad, which he conscientiously objects to. Not to mention the fact that the guy who deserted was somebody that he had become friends with, and therein lies the drama here of your duty versus your conscience.
To some level, and I mean that's where a good part of the episode 2 is kind of weird because it's one of the slower paced ones. But if you give it another watch, it is rather interesting because it gets into the whole conversation of what's also the morality, because he's from my city, I'm a member of this PAL's battalion, and I should be looking out for my other guys. And the chaplain, the padre there, is saying, well, no, he ran away from you guys. He betrayed you. And then he kind of gets to the point of it where it's like, they're not telling you, or, here's the thing that is the thing that won't lose us this war is desertion. The thing that will lose us this war is the possibility of desertion. And the fact that people can say, oh yeah, I can leave the front. And I think he said, if people were to start deserting, Manchester would be on fire by the end of the week. So basically, this said, if people start retreating, then the war could be lost. And
sure.
and again, this is something that not a lot of people know about. But in the spring of 1918, so about 2 years after this happens, there was actually massive mutinies in the French army. The Germans went on the offensive. The whole thing nearly got lost right then and there. And on the flip side, in the fall of getting into the fall, after basically the events of episode 3, when things went south for the Germans, they had the same thing. They started to have mutinies. They actually had revolutions, basically, where Soviets were coming in and communists were coming in and basically telling the soldiers they should stop fighting. And that was a good portion of where the war ended.
If you're new to this sort of thing, if you're somehow listening to this and you're like, hey, why aren't they talking about comic books? I would say even to this day, to a certain degree, though I think things may have changed with the house-to-house guerrilla style of fighting that's occurred. But for almost the entire history of the human race, the way to win the war was you set up these lines of equipment, and there's a word for all of that. It's just escaping me.
Ranks, lines, formations.
Yeah. Supplies. Jesus Christ. Yep. You're setting up your supply lines, and this is what wins you the war. If you can break the other guy's supply lines and essentially starve them out, starve them of bullets, starve them of equipment, starve them of food. This is how you begin to take territory, and then it's a matter of controlling that territory. So, what you're talking about here is if you in command, you're setting up these lines, and then even without even without the enemy being present, your lines are disintegrating because I don't want to die today. This becomes a huge problem. Obviously.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, to put things in perspective, and I mean, this is probably one of the, I'm not going to say issues, but a quibble I have with the episode is that out of the 800,000 British who died, there were actually only about 300 that were shot for desertion during the entire war.
Mm-hmm.
in the British and Commonwealth one. So it wasn't necessarily a common occurrence. It was definitely something that was, and I think certainly to our eyes, very distasteful. They even add a chyron at the end of the episode that in 2006 the British Parliament actually pardoned every single soldier who had been shot for desertion.
So, that does beg the question, do you feel like the producers of this missed an opportunity to tackle something maybe a bit juicier, a bit more palatable, a bit more interesting, a bit more important to the overall narrative of the war, and instead focused on something that didn't quite mean as much?
I've had a lot of debates over this one, because like I said, I mean, World War I is despite everything, immensely complex. It's also, for lack of a better word, it's immensely graphic. I mean, if you really want to get into the nature of what trench warfare was and what that nature was is that it was muddy, it was cold, it was wet. Some of the winters during that period were some of the wettest on record. So, I mean, you had water everywhere. You had, because of No Man's Land, I mean, they don't really there's never been a movie that really properly defines what kind of horror story No Man's Land was. Because as you said, guys were being shredded up by artillery. I mean, you never had a chance to go out and collect your dead. So the dead were the living were living among the dead. There were rats everywhere. If you remember, there was one guy during this episode who had kind of fastened a bit of a fur mohawk to the top of his helmet. I'm pretty sure that was meant to be a rat. But I mean, these guys, I've heard stories in history classes where it's like, at some point there were hands sticking out of the trenches, so you use those for coat hooks. Like it was, and I mean, the other thing that they don't touch here was the presence of gas.
Right.
And I mean, that was a truly horrifying part of it. The first gas attack was in 1915, and actually, one of my professors, David Berkeson, who's a very well-known Canadian military scholar, I had never thought of it this way, but and everyone thought the Germans used the gas, and they used it first, but everyone else started using it too. Mm-hmm. So everyone was using gas as part of it, and I mean, in the last 4 months, the last 100 days of the war, it was a chemical environment.
Sure.
Everyone had to be in gas masks all the time because they were using it all the time.
Well, not to mention, if you got that much dead piling up after a while, dead untreated breeds disease. It stinks.
Oh yeah, and there's a large argument that the following influenza outbreak in 1919 that killed about 20 million people very much was a combination of having large masses of people move around, having large masses of people being exposed to disease, and having large masses of people also be malnourished because of the war.
Okay. I think we've covered this one from soup to nuts as best we can. You want to move on to War Machine? Let's move on to War Machine. Okay, so third episode and final episode here. This is our tank episode. 4 years into the war, the British deployed tanks along the German border to break the stalemate. Yes, nothing like a giant armored machine rolling over people to just stir it up a bit. A young Chas Rowland joins the crew of one of these tanks, the Niveler. I think I'm pronouncing that right.
My pronunciation of French is not that good, so.
As it prepares for the Battle of Amiens, but the coming days will take their toll on the crew, and Chas must brave fumes and a temperamental engine and cramped conditions to deliver a message home. All right, so one of the things I remembered about this was if I remember correctly, was the tank engine just kept giving, like, we've got this great plan here. If we can only get the fucking thing to the front line.
Oh, yeah, and I mean, that was one of the big problems with the tanks at the time. I mean, they talk about something, this was one of the few tanks to get through. A lot of them stopped because they just broke down.
Right.
They weren't overly reliable things. Like, I mean, I think you were getting a 90% casualty rate just from breakdowns. And then, of course, you've just had enough. We're also not talking, when people think tank, they think something that you can, fire a machine gun at all day and it'll come back smiling at you. These were not that heavily armored. So, I mean, you had, like, if these guys had put a 50 cal on it or, a small field piece or something, it would have gone right through that tank. Mm-hmm. And I mean, to talk about some of the conditions inside, and they show this where apparently somebody decided to put the tank's ventilation system right beside the exhaust pipe, so exhaust was constantly being pumped in. And then that's also not counting the fact that all of the guns were internally mounted. So basically you had both exhaust gas and you also had exhaust gas from all the machine guns in there.
Yeah, I remember there's a bit where I think one of the characters is vomiting from all the fumes and whatnot.
Yep.
So what did you think of this episode?
I thought it was quite good. I mean, it's kind of a unique story within the First World War. The use of the first tanks, the myriad of issues with them. I mean, some of the conversations around how tanks were employed, how tank crews came together, a little bit of the conversation around, to this point, we've had units of people who were trained together, came up together, fought together, and this is the case of to use a common term, of a replacement coming in, of a new guy coming in, a couple of new guys coming into what's a really battle hardened unit, and how those relationships form, and then also it's obviously framed around the whole idea of the lead character finding a letter home and trying to take that back to the man's wife.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting way to end the. It was I felt like it was an unexpected way to end the episode, because it was very heavily tank focused, and they're telling the story of how they use these tanks in battles and whatnot, and then there's this whole other thing with the letter, which seemed like a bit of a mishmash.
Yeah, I mean it is, and I mean it almost would have been interesting to do. Because I'm thinking back to some of the really good HBO series that have been done on World War II, like Band of Brothers of the Pacific, and I mean, they kind of cut off an episode at the end to say, here's actually how the war ended, here's how everyone reintegrated, and things like that. So I think it's a little bit of a shortfall in the series that way. I mean, I thought again. Credit where credit's due. I've seen some pretty poor acting when we do historical dramatizations, but I think everyone in this episode was really on point. Mm-hmm. And I mean, one of the things that this series does well is kind of give you the experience of war in terms of the idea of stress, the idea of uncertainty, the idea of fear, and things like that.
So let me ask you. They're going to do our World War II, okay? Not World War II, but our World War, the sequel. And they go to you, they employ you as a consultant, and they say, okay, we're trying to figure out, as you said, you have this massive war, this very complex war. We want to draw more eyeballs. Andrew, what should the next 3 episodes be about? What would what's the stories you want? What are the stories you want to tell that would engage people and really give them a taste for what this grinder was all about?
Well, I think just kind of going to what they've set up here, I think one of the interesting things would be to come back and go back to the infantry in getting into 1917 and 1918, where we start to go away from kind of line tactics, and the British employed what was called bite and hold. So basically they would say, we have an objective, we're going to set up a fire plan where we use a lot of artillery, but we're going to use a lot of artillery very carefully, and we're going to pound certain targets to make sure, and then the second thing they're going to use is what's called a creeping or rolling barrage. So basically the artillery is on a timetable to say, you'll be on this coordinate at 10, this coordinate at 10:05, this coordinate at 10:10. And then what the infantry's job at that point was, once they get out over the top, they're trailing that artillery barrage. And if you go too fast, you'll get caught in your own artillery. If you go too slow, you'll get too far behind it. You'll lose protection of that artillery, because ideally what you want to do is have that artillery walk you up right onto the German lines, and when it lifts, you jump right in there and go after them.
Oh, that does sound exciting. If they ever decide to do this again, I hope they call on you.
Yeah, the second one I'd probably do, just again, as kind of an interesting one. If we want to keep it more ground based, then I mean, what you could probably do is do some interesting stuff around an artillery battery, and talk about what that was like, because I mean, as I said, these guys were firing a lot of artillery every day. So I mean, not only did you have the danger of working around artillery itself, but as the war went on, you also had work towards what was called counter battery work. So these guys would actually start using listening devices and microphones to actually chart and figure out where artillery was coming from, then zero in your own artillery and kill that artillery before your attacks took place, so you can't use that.
How about subs? How about showing one of the sub battles?
Sub to sub wasn't really that common until probably modern times. What you could do, and this would be something that you'd have to be very careful with in terms of tone, is doing convoy work. So that would be like actually being on a convoy, going across, trying to avoid being sunk by a submarine, by a U-boat. And I mean, you could make that one really, really tense. I mean, I think when you think back to what submarine warfare is like, Christopher Nolan nailed it pretty well in Dunkirk, where it's like, oh, we're fine, torpedo. Yeah, and actually, an interesting one, Freya. Torpedoes weren't used that much in World War I. Actually, what the more common tactic was, they were operating at night. What they would actually do is that all of those subs had deck guns on them, so they'd actually surface beside and they wouldn't do this again. They'd use torpedoes against military craft. Against the civilian craft, they'd surface and then fire into them with a deck gun.
Okay.
And one of the things they actually did, and I mean this would be a fun little bit, is what the British started doing was actually built dummy vessels. So they looked like civilian transport carriers and stuff like that. And I mean, you would the U-boat would crawl up beside it, get ready to fire into it. Then they'd drop the doors, and hey, look, there's a bunch of deck guns that would go firing after it.
Surprise!
All right, exactly.
Okay, we're gonna wrap up here. Anything left unsaid? Go ahead and give a final pitch here to people who are listening to this and but haven't seen it yet, and why they should.
I thoroughly enjoyed the series. I think it's shot in an engaging way. I think it's acted in an engaging way. I mean, yeah, it's a little light on kind of the overall context and history, but I mean, I think this is getting people to engage and understand what that war was about in large parts. From a very kind of man on the ground point of view. And I mean, I think the way modern history has happened or modern history in terms of the way it's told, is that more historians are getting better at being able to tell those two sides of the story. But overall, I mean, I think it's a story well worth watching if you want to go beyond the normal kind of narrator, historical footage, period music, that sort of thing.
All right, and that is the end of our show. I agree. Go give Our World War a chance. Only 3 episodes, 3 hours of your life. It's on Netflix. Try to fit it in between The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina and Daredevil. All right, we need to talk about. I'm going to pin you down here, sir. We need to talk about The Crown.
Yes, we do.
We have a whole second season we haven't done again. By the time we get to it, it'll be season 3. So when are we doing The Crown? When are we doing The Crown?
Let me talk to Alicia on that one. I know we're pretty busy in December this year, but let me talk to her and find out. I mean, we watched all of season 2, so. Have you finished season 1, by the way?
Yes, I did. I started into season 2, and I was telling my wife, I'm like, well, I can't watch this. I don't have a podcast planned yet. And she was like, hey, how about you just live your life and watch a show with me and not worry about doing a podcast? I'm like, okay. Yeah, we got about an episode into it, so I will be rewatching that again. Okay. I'm going to pitch you January 31st. That's a Thursday. If you guys are available, and if not, then we'll look into another Thursday.
Let me double check with Alicia on that one, but I think that could possibly work.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and pencil it in there, and if I have to change it, then we'll change it. It's a great thing about having an internet calendar.
Oh, exactly.
The Crown. Shit. TVPT, The Crown, Season 2. She's coming back for seconds, huh? Your wife is a sport.
Yep. Well, I mean, she enjoyed the series. I mean, season 2 is really good. Mm-hmm. It's got some bits that are hard to get through, and then there's some really interesting stuff to chat about. But it's quite enjoyable.
All right, very good. Go ahead. Now I know that you don't do any podcasts outside of the occasional one with me, but there is some stuff you're into. So go ahead and do the plugs that are meaningful to you.
Alrighty then. I think subject-wise, since I already mentioned a couple of things, but definitely Dan Carlin's Hardcore History episodes. There's about 6 of them. It's about 26 hours long, called Countdown to Armageddon. That's well worth a listen. I've been through university courses on World Wars, and this is a pretty good equivalency to one of them.
Wow, high praise.
Mark, I think we were talking about Margaret Macmillan's 1919, Paris 1919. That's a great book. The other side of that, I'd also say, is actually she's got another book that you probably enjoy called The War That Ended Peace, that actually covers how the war started and how it was set up.
Okay.
And also there's a great, I recently just found out this week actually, there's a great week-by-week breakdown of the First World War called The Great War on YouTube. That basically is kind of wrapping up its run now that the war ended. I guess they actually started in 2014 and have been doing an episode every week since then.
Wow, good stuff. Okay.
Yep. And then, of course, I train at Havoc JKD in Calgary with Sifu Jay Cooper, and we're part of the larger Jeet Kune Do Athletic Association under Sifu Harinder Singh Sabharwal. So if you're interested in fantastic training in terms of both self-defense, personal improvement, anything along that line, please do give us a search on Facebook or Google.
Thank you for joining me tonight. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I learn from you. I think you're a great person to have on here. I have to get you on more often. You're a pleasure to talk to.
Oh, thank you very much. I very much enjoyed doing these.
As for what's going on in the wonderful world of the Rad Legend Broadcasting Network, this past week we woke the sleeping dragon. Sick of it all. New York Hardcore for Life on the Metal Hammer of Doom. Tuesday, myself and Robert Winfrey had a long discussion about what it is to be a single woman somewhere in a Grinch review. That's how that went down. You have to see the Grinch to understand why we did that.
Is it worth seeing?
I mean, you've got kids. It's fun to go out into the movies with your kids if they're well behaved enough to sit through a 90-minute movie, and this thing is less than 90 minutes. You know, it's not earth shattering or anything, but it was a fun distraction. My kids enjoyed it.
I'm kind of debating between because I generally try to take Annabelle to a movie year, and it's like, you know, do I take her to this or do I take her to Wreck-It Ralph? There doesn't seem to be like a big Disney tentpole aside from Wreck-It Ralph this year, so it's like, darn.
Yeah, this year the only other Disney feature is Wreck-It Ralph. Well, you know what? She's 2 though. I don't know how. You know, my daughter.
Annabelle's 5.
Oh, Annabelle's 5. Okay, that's what your son's the 2-year-old. Yeah, why not? Go, you know, take it to both. Next, I think it's either next year or the year after is actually Frozen 2. So you'll.
I think it's next year, so she'll be all over that one. So
yeah, absolutely. Anyway. We started off the week with source material, Deadpool Kills the Marvel Universe. Next week, we've got Gavin Napier of the Casual Heroes on source material looking at Justice League America, The Tornado's Path. Myself and Robert Winfrey will be reviewing the new Fantastic Beasts, The Crimes of Grindelwald. Our pre-Thanksgiving turkey episode for the Metal Hammer of Doom this year is Hoobastank. Push
oh my
pull.
God.
Yes, they actually released a new album. And then on Thanksgiving, after you've eaten your turkey and watched your football and taken your nap, you can catch an extra episode of the Metal Hammer of Doom. It'll just be Jesse and Robert. They'll be doing Throssenblatt. That's a real thing. Next week after that, we end November, wrap up November with a look at all things Robin Hood and Bow and Arrow. We got Hawkeye, My Life as a Weapon, the Matt Fraction authored comic book. We're going to look at the first 4 issues, Volume 1, if you've got the trade. We're going to review the new piece of shit Robin Hood movie with Tager Adgerton, or whatever the hell you pronounce his name.
Oh, man, that looks awful, and that's too bad because I really like him as an actor.
You know, he walked away from the Kingsman series.
Yeah, I heard that. I mean, I haven't seen Kingsman 2 yet. I'm kind of behind on stuff, but that's too bad because I do like him as an actor.
Yeah, it's a really odd choice. You know. Anyway, yeah, this Robin Hood looks terrible.
Yeah. Will it be any worse than King Arthur and what's it called with the guy from Pacific Rim?
Well, we'll find out.
I haven't seen that one, but I heard it's fairly bad. So
yeah, I saw it, but you know, due to chemo treatments last year, I think I ended up missing that episode. So Robert did it himself, and it was one of those where he wanted to review it and then regretted it.
Yeah.
We've got the Metal Hammer of Doom POD Circles, Booyaka Booyaka. And then we'll be putting the Kevin Costner Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves on trial. And finally, on December 1st, myself, Pat Mullen, and possibly Gavin Napier. I don't know if you're into boxing at all. I think you're an MMA guy. Yeah, you're definitely an MMA guy.
Yep.
But on occasion, boxing. Well, we all know how I love the heavyweights. And this one, this one is a sight to behold. Deontay Wilder versus Tyson Fury will be providing live commentary.
Oh, that'll be fun.
Yeah, I'm excited for this. So that's all the news that's fit to print. Once again, thank you, Andrew Graham. This has been TV Party Tonight. Be well, be safe, and behave.